Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. And as always, it's your one-stop shop to take stock of all the progress on the political and literal battlefields. Now let's go ahead and get started with the latest stories straight out of Ukraine. Russia's assaults on Ukraine are continuously causing civilian casualties and widespread devastation. Last week's attacks have mostly targeted Donetsk, Kherson, and the Sumy regions.
In the Kherson region, Russian forces targeted multiple settlements, including the administrative center of the region, the city of Kherson. 4 people have been killed.
We were at home. The first shot hit the store, the second one hit the street. There is no house there anymore, but more importantly, there are no people. The strike killed 2 women.
A Russian missile struck the city of Mykolaiv, killing a woman and injuring at least 23 people. The attack damaged an industrial facility, shops, and residential buildings. People were also killed in attacks on the town of Ceasefire and the villages in the Donetsk region. Russia also attempted a drone attack against Kyiv and surrounding towns. All drones were shot down. However, falling fragments damaged an apartment building in the Ukrainian capital and caused fire at a farm in the region.
Ukrainian authorities have announced mandatory evacuations in parts of the Kharkiv and Sumy regions as Russian forces continue to intensify their assaults in these areas.
The governor of the Kharkiv region confirmed that evacuations would take place in the strategic city of Kupiansk and nearby communities due to advancements made by the Russian army. Kupiansk, a key city, has faced persistent shelling, making it impossible to restore essential services such as electricity, heat, and water. Evacuation orders have been issued for Borova, another crucial foothold of Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, in the Sumy region, guided aerial bomb attacks by the Russian army have displaced close to 37,000 people.
If I were half a meter away from the bed, I would have been dead. I laid down and heard something rattling. I got up, and before I could take a step, the window blew out.
Sumy, on Ukraine's northeastern border with Russia, has experienced incessant shelling, leading to mandatory evacuations, particularly within the 10-kilometer zone bordering Russia.
Ukraine's military intelligence has successfully recaptured 400 hectares of forest in the Kharkiv region, marking a significant victory. Ukrainian forces have also successfully identified and struck a Russian military training facility.
Areas north of the village of Liptsy near the Russian border have been liberated. Ukrainian forces ambushed a Russian battalion there, eliminating 3 motorized rifle units and a reconnaissance team, and reportedly taking Russian soldiers captive. This success follows a similar operation in August when Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade advanced nearly 2 square kilometers into the Kharkiv region, while repelling Russian attacks near Borova. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Operational Command South has struck a Russian military training facility. The attack, captured through drone footage, targeted approximately 20 Russian soldiers, though details on casualties were not provided. The strike reportedly employed cluster munitions, which are part of the crucial aid packages provided by the US.
Krylo Budanov, the head of Ukraine's defense intelligence, has confirmed that approximately 11,000 North Korean infantry troops are currently being trained in Russia. They're expected to be ready for combat against Ukraine by the 1st of November.
Budanov disclosed that the Russian troops are undergoing training in Russia's eastern regions, where they are equipped with Russian arms and ammunition. While the first group will be combat ready by November 1st, no detailed information on the further movement of the remaining troops has been provided. This revelation follows earlier reports by South Korea's Ministry of Defense, suggesting North Korea's growing involvement in aiding Russia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenski has condemned North Korea's increasing military support for Russia, which encompasses both weapons and personnel. Zelensky has also stated that North Korea had de facto entered the war in early October. Additionally, reports have confirmed that North Korea has been sending workers to Russian factories, further strengthening ties between Moscow and Pyongyang amid the ongoing conflict.
Ukraine's defense ministry announced that the domestically produced Chaklun drone has been approved for use. The country has relied heavily on unmanned systems in its defense against Russia.
Chaklons are designed to assist in adjusting artillery fire and are resistant to Russian electronic warfare, thanks to their high-tech materials. They can also operate in poor weather conditions with control software developed by Ukrainian programmers. The introduction of these advanced drones is part of Ukraine's broader investment in drone technology, a critical asset in countering Russia's larger military forces. Throughout the war, drones have been pivotal for Ukraine in striking Russian targets, including warships, naval bases, oil refineries, and airfields deep within occupied territory and Russia itself. Defense Minister Rustem Umerov stated that Ukrainian drones have successfully destroyed or damaged over 200 military facilities in Russia over the past year, using swarming tactics.
The United States and Australia have announced new aid packages to further support Ukraine in its defense against Russian aggression. Additional support will include tanks, air-to-ground munitions, armored vehicles, as well as other critical supplies.
Mr. President, welcome back to the White House.
Washington is providing over $400 million in security assistance, along with numerous defense systems vital to Ukraine's ongoing defensive. Over the next few months, support, including hundreds of interceptors, tactical systems, artillery, and vehicles, will be delivered to the country. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenski thanked the US, mentioning the inclusion of long-range weapons, though further details have not been disclosed.
I am grateful to President Biden, both parties in Congress, and the American people for the $425 million defense package announced today, which includes new air defense systems and long-range weapons.
Australia, in turn, has pledged to contribute 49 Abrams tanks as part of a $163 million military aid package. These tanks will boost Ukraine's armored brigades, enhancing both firepower and mobility. Australia's Defence Industry Minister, Pat Conroy, said the tanks are a significant upgrade following previous contributions of over $1 billion in aid to Ukraine since the war began.
And now joining me to discuss these and other issues is George Barros, team lead on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War. Hello, George. Thank you very much for joining me again on Ukraine this week.
Thank you very much for having me, Don. It's good to see you again.
Now, the Institute for the Study of War has reported a rise in the executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war by Russian military forces. Now, what is your current assessment on this? Are these isolated incidents? Is this more systemic, implicating some of those higher up in the chain of command?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely seems to be a feature of the system and not a bug. We've collected series of different confirmed instances of Russian soldiers stripping, laying down Ukrainian soldiers, in a premeditated, deliberate way, executing them in a methodical way that indicates that it was premeditated. And taken into the larger context that it's not just one or two or three of these events, but there's many of them, it indicates that this does seem to be part of Russian command culture. It does indicate that the junior officers who oversee these individual soldiers who conduct these war crimes, they aren't punished. They're not reprimanded by the higher echelons of the command. And oftentimes, we've even collected some instances of Russian commanders of units whose men did conduct and participate in war crimes, not just be reprimanded, but be actually praised by the Russian state and receive state honors and medals. So this does indeed seem to be a feature of the Russian way of war.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about the front lines in eastern Ukraine. Volodar has now fallen. There seems to be a renewed effort on the southern front line in Dnipropetrovsk and the Zaporizhia regions. What's your current assessment on this part of the front line?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the current moment, the Russians are still leaning into their offensive operations in eastern Ukraine in the Pokrovsk direction. In recent weeks, we've actually seen the Russians try to deprioritize lateral attacks going directly towards Pokrovsk city. In recent weeks, they've actually turned to their southern flank and tried to widen their penetration, likely in order to help flatten out the battlefield geometry and have a more stable and defensible front. A couple weeks ago, if you looked at the Russian advance just west of Avdiivka, you could see that there was a salient protrusion that is inherently vulnerable to potential Ukrainian counterattacks. But if they are able to widen their penetration, widen out their flanks, flatten out that salient, then it becomes much more defensible. It's looking increasingly likely that Russian forces may not seize Pokrovsk by the end of this year. It just seems that the tempo of operations has been decreasing. The fall mud season is starting to settle in and affecting Russian operations elsewhere in the theater, notably in Kursk. That's soon going to come to fruition in Pokrovsk as well. And recently, we've seen the Russians reactivating previously dormant parts of the front line in the south. Over the last 2 weeks, since the beginning of October, Russian forces have reactivated on the Zaporizhia front line, a front line that's been basically inactive since the Ukrainian counteroffensive of last summer. Russians have managed to advance over a dam in Kamensky near the Kakhovka reservoir, and then they've also managed to make some tactical gains in the easternmost part of Zaporizhia Oblast, or that seam between Donetsk Oblast and Zaporizhia Oblast. There's a village called Levadne that the Russians reportedly seized just the other day as well. So the theater remains dynamic. It remains interesting. The war, it progresses. This war is not stalemated, and we're far from in a stable equilibrium.
Now, last week, General Syrskyi said that Russians redeployed around 50,000 Russian troops from the front lines in Ukraine to Russia's Kursk region. Do you believe that this is plausible based on the progress that we're seeing there by the Russians on the front lines there in Ukraine?
That sounds about right. That seems consistent with all the open source evidence that we're able to collect at the Institute. We're able to confirm that of the roughly 1,000 square kilometers that the Ukrainians managed to seize up there in Kursk, the Russians have retaken at least about a third of it. The Russians claim that they've gotten about half of it, but we can confirm up to a third. That about tracks. We're tracking, which different divisions, brigades, and regiments and different formations have been redeployed up there, and that's a really hefty amount of combat power. I mean, that's about 5 divisions, give or take, worth of infantry, and the Russians had to rob Peter to pay Paul. They redeployed guys from the Kharkiv direction with their cross-border invasion force, which that Russian effort has petered out in the recent months, and they've also stripped Russian forces from the southern front line, which is going to impact those Russian operational groups' readiness and ability to be able to conduct subsequent operations after the current Russian major offensive effort in the Pokrovsk-Avdiivka area culminates.
And so what does that do for the area there in Kursk as far as Ukrainian forces are concerned? Do you think they're going to be able to hold a certain amount of ground there and stay there for at least the short to medium term?
The situation remains very fluid and very dynamic, so I'm hesitant to make a really firm call, but I'll just say, ceteris paribus, looking at all the current trends, I think if the Ukrainians manage to hold out and hold a part of the salient through the end of fall, then they'll likely be able to get through into the new year, into winter. But at the strategic level of war, I must say the salient in Kursk really isn't all that interesting. It's 1,000 kilometers of territory, and if the Ukrainians actually lose it, then that could actually potentially be a good thing, asterisk. This Ukrainian incursion into Kursk is much bigger than just some chunk of territory that they hold in Kursk. It's actually about strategic resourcing of this war for Russia. If you zoom out on the map and look at the international border between Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, that's not part of the active fighting in eastern Ukraine, there's about 1,000 kilometers of territory there. And what's happened throughout the course of the first 2.5 years of this war is that the Russians didn't have to pay the proper MSRP for having 1,000 kilometers of frontage in the theater. This is like between a third to a half of the frontage in the theater, where they've not had to deploy heavy units, they've not had to have defense in depth, and they've been able to focus all their units and combat power in the east and the south. This incursion that the Ukrainians conducted, they can repeat it again if the Russians continue to not properly resource and defend the international border. So if the destruction of the current Ukrainian gains in Kursk comes at the trade-off of now the Russians have to properly re-engage and double their investments to actually properly defend an additional 1,000 kilometers of frontage, that's not a bad trade.
It's not a bad trade as long as it takes resources away from some of those really hot spots along the front lines, right? All the way from Kupiansk down to Chasiv Yar, then down to Pokrovsk and beyond. Do you think that would be the case, potentially?
If Putin wants to properly defend the international border and ensure that Ukrainian forces can't collapse a weak, sort of trigger force, tripwire forces right there, just sitting into some trenches, it's going to be required. Yeah. I mean, just to deal with the salient, the Russians have had to redeploy, like you said, like Siersky said, 50,000 troops, 5 divisions, to cover an additional, 900 kilometers of territory. That's going to require the redeployment of substantial resources. I mean, multiple field armies, scores of divisions. I mean, it's a really large investment, and not just the infantry and the ground forces, but they're going to have to operate air defense systems in the air domain. They're going to have to redeploy electronic warfare systems. These are really high, low density but high demand assets that the Russians have in limited quantities. The Russians currently have the luxury of just having to concentrate those things in the south and the east, where the current active front lines are. Mm-hmm. But if you expand the geometry of the theater, that really forces them to make some decisions about not just where to put the rank and file soldiers, but these high-end systems too. And look, if the Russians don't decide to reinforce the border even if they manage to seize this Ukrainian salient in Kursk, there's fundamentally nothing preventing Ukrainian brigades from, again, doing this in a different part of Kursk Oblast or in Bryansk Oblast or Belgorod or elsewhere. So, look, this is about strategic resourcing. It's about increasing the Kremlin's bottom line for what it costs to actually maintain a protracted war against Ukraine for a long time. And it helps undermine some of the key critical planning assumptions that undergird Putin's theory of victory for this war. That Russia can just wage a protracted war because he can afford the costs at the current rate. And this will substantially increase the cost if he decides to properly defend this length of border.
Recently, there have been suggestions of a ceasefire in Ukraine. Some are saying the occupied territories should become a buffer zone. Others are calling for an immediate end of hostilities to allow for peace talks. Who would benefit the most from a ceasefire, and could this benefit Ukraine in any way?
Yeah, the ceasefire unambiguously benefits the Kremlin and the Russian war machine. It doesn't benefit Ukraine at all, as far as I'm concerned. It actually would precipitate a catastrophe in Ukraine. Look, the Russians aren't happy and satisfied with the current territorial gains. They currently occupy about a fifth of Ukraine. But they continue to articulate and we continue to assess that their objectives go far beyond what they currently have. They want to seize all of Kherson and Zaporizhia and Donetsk and Luhansk, many territories and strategic cities that the Russians don't even yet occupy. But they still fundamentally want to implement the 2022 vision of seizing Kyiv and destroying the Ukrainian state as a political entity. Because in reality, in the Kremlin's worldview, there is no such thing as Ukrainians. There's just Russians that got confused and think that they're a separate nation. If there's a hostation of facilities, that will provide the Russians a operational pause in which the shooting will stop. They'll be able to use their war machine, war industrial base, their recruitment centers to be able to reconstitute and reestablish an even more superlative benefit of mass than what the Russians currently have. And they'll be able to use the 20% of occupied Ukraine as a massive lodgment with really preferable geography to be able to then launch a second phase of this war in the future at a time and place of Putin's choosing. Very similarly to how the Russians used what was previously 7% of occupied Ukraine that they seized illegally in 2014 to then facilitate and become the lodgment and a launch pad for the big-scale war in 2022. They sat on those ill-gotten gains for almost a decade, and they will do so the same with what Ukraine has now. Russian readiness is only going to increase if there's a hostation of facilities or a ceasefire or peace talks or whatever you want to call it. Russia, sanctions are going to melt away. The Russian war industrial base will be able to re-equip the military. The Russians currently recruit about 30,000 men per month, most of whom are killed or wounded in Ukraine. So it's basically enough to maintain the tempo of operations, but not enough to grow the force substantially, especially going back to pre-war levels of readiness. If the war stops, those casualties are going to cease, and the Russian readiness is going to increase precipitously. Simultaneously, for the Ukrainian side, if the shooting stops, then all of a sudden Zelenskyy is no longer going to have a basis for which to have martial law, for which he is keeping military-aged Ukrainian men within the country. all of those men are going to flee and take advantage of the visa-free regime that with the European Union, and they're all going to leave Ukraine. The political pressure for the military units that are fighting and defending Ukraine right now to demobilize during a ceasefire is going to be immense and insurmountable. So you're going to have this scenario where Ukrainian preparedness and readiness is going to collapse. Russian readiness is going to increase. The Russians are going to have a much more preferable geography within Ukraine to resume a war at their time and choosing. And Putin has indicated that that's all that he really wants to do. So our best bet for a victory that secures the United States and NATO's and Ukraine's interests is actually decisively defeating the invasion now and not giving the Russians the breather that they need to be able to finish the job on Russia's terms.
Okay, George Barros, team leader on the Russia-Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War. Thank you very much for joining me today on Ukraine This Week. Always appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Don. Always great talking to you.
President Zelensky has unveiled his victory plan before Ukraine's parliament and in Brussels, aiming to secure increased military and financial support. This comes almost a month after an intensive diplomatic tour in the United States, which failed to drum up the anticipated support from key Western leaders, including the presidential candidates Donald Trump and Kamala Harris.
On October 16th, Zelensky presented the plan to the Ukrainian parliament and to Brussels the following day. The plan consists of 5 main points, seeking increased support, particularly from the United States. Experts have suggested the proposal also reflects Kyiv's awareness of the international community's growing fatigue with the prolonged conflict. The plan's first point calls for an immediate invitation for Ukraine to join NATO, followed by a plea to focus on strengthening Ukraine's defense industry and lifting restrictions on missile strikes against military targets within Russia. The next point includes beefing up Ukraine's defense capabilities, strengthening its domestic defense industry, boosting air defense, removing restrictions on weapon use, and a continuation of Ukrainian military operations on Russian soil. The plan also proposes deploying a comprehensive non-nuclear strategic deterrence package on Ukrainian soil to prevent further Russian aggression. Further points involve signing a special agreement with Western partners to protect and utilize Ukraine's strategic mineral resources, vital for the country's economic and security interest. Lastly, the fifth point offers to station Ukrainian soldiers in European military bases, potentially replacing American forces. Notably, 3 annexes remain classified and have only been shared with Ukraine's partners. After meeting with 27 EU leaders, Zelensky announced 18 of them had taken a stance on the plan, with the majority expressing full support.
And now joining me this week to discuss the Ukrainian victory plan, we have 2 guests, and that is Yevheniia Kravchuk, Deputy Chair, Ukrainian Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy. Hello and welcome. And Reuben Johnson, Research Fellow at the Casimir Pulaski Foundation. Hello and thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week. Now, Yevheniia, I'd like to start with you. President Zelensky said something that caught, I think, pretty much everybody's ear yesterday in Brussels at the press conference when he said that, well, if Ukraine doesn't get an invitation to NATO, then there's really only one other choice, and that is that Ukraine may need to proliferate or make its own nuclear weapons. We all know that after the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine was the 3rd largest nuclear power in the world, and, well, the security guarantees mean little at this point, right? So I'd like to just get your thoughts on this statement by President Zelensky and the sincerity of such a statement.
Thank you for having me and bringing this topic. Of course, you know, the situation about the nukes is heated even in Ukraine and especially in social media. But I would like to underline what President Zelensky said. He said that obviously to have security guarantees for Ukraine, there are just, you know, 2 feasible options. And we chose option to be part of the NATO. So he actually said that for us, being part of the alliance, which is actually, you know, the only alliance we can join in the military, tactics is the only choice. So, and he mentioned today that Ukraine is not doing the nuclear weapons. But of course, we do all remember the 90s and giving up this nuclear arsenal. And all people understand that, we just gave it away, but did not get any security guarantees. So that's why it's important for Ukraine now to have a real security guarantees. And if you are looking on the victory plan, and it's rightly, as you mentioned, it's not just victory plan of Zelensky. Now it's a victory plan of Ukraine because it was supported by the parliament. It was supported by all the fractions and groups that are in the parliament, both, the majority and the opposition. The first point is invitation to NATO. It's not joining NATO right away. It just sending a very strong signal to Kremlin that Ukraine will not be left in the gray zone.
And if we listen to the new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, he has said numerous times that he is confident that Ukraine will become a member, maybe not the next member, but the member after that. Yet, Mark Rutte said, and Reuben, this one's for you, Mark Rutte said that there was a few points in this victory plan that he didn't agree with, and the invitation to join NATO is one of them.
Yes, the victory plan, first of all, there's some secret protocols that we don't really know what's in those. Those are going to be briefed to some members of the leaders of the main factions in the Ukrainian parliament and some of Ukraine's partners. But the stuff that has been made public, one of the items I spoke about yesterday was this idea that there would be a non-nuclear deterrent based on Ukrainian soil, targeting presumably Russian strategic points. This would have to be long-range, conventionally tipped, probably ground-launched or air-launched cruise missiles, and that probably is not something that NATO members can agree to now because they're always afraid of the provocation angle. One of the points which I don't think gets enough attention is one of the latter ones, which is that Ukraine is saying that once the war is over, they would be willing to send Ukrainian soldiers to be based in countries in NATO where U.S. soldiers are based now, therefore relieving some of the U.S. burden that is currently held by placing our own troops on European soil and freeing up those American troops for operations in Asia. But I also want to caution everybody, Ukraine can be invited to join NATO, but it's not an instantaneous action. All nations which are invited to join NATO are given what's called a membership action plan. They have to meet certain requirements. There are certain things they have to do, and there are off-ramps if they don't meet certain requirements by a certain date. So I'm one of those people that strongly supports Ukraine's entry into NATO, but there are many people who question the efficacy of that right now.
Right. Well, one of the main criticisms of this is that currently there's a territorial dispute in Ukraine, right? You have Crimea, you have the occupied territories, and obviously you can't join NATO while these territories are disputed. But in the eventuality that this would somehow be put to bed, if you will, I don't think that Ukraine could even possibly negotiate without having an invitation to NATO. Yevheniia, is there any other way that Ukraine can even sit at the table, have peace talks, and consider potentially conceding land, Ukrainian land, which I know is not something that Ukraine wants to do, but is it even feasible without an invitation on the table?
Well, it's not feasible without or with the invitation, because no politician in Ukraine will conceive any territorial, territories of Ukraine. So we do understand that the territories, all of the occupied territories, will not be returned in a military way. But there has to be circumstances put together that Ukraine can restore its territorial integrity at the end of the day. It may happen later, but it should happen if we do want to restore the world order and the respect of the international recognized borders. That's the point. And thank you for bringing up the question about the point 5 about the deploying Ukrainian troops in other countries. That is very practical step that is easily explained to such countries as United States or Canada, who are sending troops overseas to Baltic states, for example, or any of the states that calls that they need more troops of NATO countries deployed. And actually, Ukraine does have a well-trained army that knows how to use different Western types of weapons and actually battle-proofed. So I think it's something that we can be a donor of for European security. And another point that also is very practical is the point about the natural resources. And it has two sides. From the one side, if Ukraine gets occupied, all the lithium, titanium, gas, and other natural resources will be taken by Russia, or then sent over to China, and that's where the interest of the United States comes, because they do not want to have these natural resources given to these countries, and of course it's the overall idea of just peace. If the Western world cannot cannot make the situation so Ukraine is strong enough to sit at the table, then what have we done all these years?
Yeah, very good point. Back to the donor of European security, Reuben, is this something that would be attractive to the United States? Is this something that would be attractive to, say, Donald Trump, who might be looking to save money on European defense in some which way or form? Could this be a potential solution?
Well, okay.
Or it's complicated.
I don't. Someone has to explain to me what's the rationale behind giving up territory. And I understand what Yevheniia said. She's absolutely correct about these critical strategic resources. But there's a more basic point. We have photos, we have video, we have evidence, we have witnesses. We know what happens to people in areas that are occupied by the Russians. The men get castrated. The women get raped and murdered, and then their bodies burned in an attempt to cover up war crimes. And the children get kidnapped and taken away to be raised as Russians and brainwashed. So who would sign up for that? And who would demand that another country sign up for it? That's what I don't understand. I really need someone to explain this to me. And I also get rather worked up about the issue of money. Everyone's always talking about money, money, money. Okay, the aid to Ukraine, count the fingers. Mm-hmm. It's 5% of the U.S. annual defense budget is what we are dedicating to Ukraine. And the money doesn't go to Ukraine. The money stays in America. The money goes to American defense companies to build more equipment to replace the stuff we pulled off the shelf and we've sent to Ukraine to aid their military. So the money stays in America. It keeps American defense workers occupied, and we don't have enough of them. So the more money we can put towards American defense workers, the better off we're going to be in the long run. Everybody wins on this, and I don't know why everyone keeps talking about it like it's a loss for someone. Not a loss for anybody except the Russians.
Well, I agree. It's a very good, it's a lot of bang for your buck, if you will, as far as the taxpayers are concerned. But Yevheniia, I'd like to ask you, what is the feeling in Ukraine after President Zelensky has come back from the General Assembly, having the Ramstein format canceled last week? The Ramstein summit because of Joe Biden having to attend to the hurricane. And then, of course, on Friday, we have this meeting with Biden and, of course, the leaders of Italy, France, and Germany in Berlin. Zelensky's not there. What is the feeling? Are Ukrainians feeling a bit abandoned at this point?
Well, Ukrainians feel that the whole world is watching what happens on the November 5th. And that's on the one side, understandable. But on the other side, I mean, Ukraine has to learn how to defend itself and not just look over the Atlantic Ocean and wait until DC says something that Germany can or cannot do. the long-range weapons, because we're still stuck with the decision of Schultz not giving the permission or giving Tauros to Ukrainians. And we also heard the Brits saying that, well, Ukraine should use their own long-range weapons. Yes, we will use our own long-range weapons, but we need more investments in our own military production. That's another option we can take. Our military production is working on the 1/3 that it can produce. We, launched new productions. Drones, even our own, ballistics, and doing the 155 caliber, but we pay for this with our own taxes. So basically, we still, are lacking the decision of different countries of giving money and investing in military production in Ukraine. And look what's happening with this axis of evil. North Koreans are sending troops, literally sending troops. At the same time, we're waiting, discussing, measuring the red lines and their level of readiness. These autocrats are really serious about taking the world, and we're still, hesitant of giving a proper answer.
Absolutely. And Reuben, this week we have reports of Russian drones being manufactured in China and shipped to the battlefield. So joint production with the Chinese. I know the State Department has come out and sanctioned some Chinese companies, I believe 2 and 1 Russian individual. And we also have North Korea potentially joining the battlefield. Where's the United States red line? When are we going to say enough is enough and actually do something about this? Because
that's a bloody good question, and I want to return to the reason it's a good question. I want to return to a topic that was broached earlier here. If the United States doesn't stand up and show its mettle and say this is it, enough is enough, we are going to push back. Well, the lesson that other countries are going to draw, not just Ukraine, but Poland, Taiwan, the Republic of South Korea, Japan, Australia, all these other countries are going to go and develop their own nuclear weapons because they're going to say, well, it's obvious the United States doesn't have the back of its friends and allies anymore. We can no longer depend on their nuclear umbrella to save us. We're going to have our own. And I think would be just disastrous, but no one's thinking more than 5 minutes ahead. They all just say, oh, we want the war to be over. Like that's a magical solution. Like that suddenly will make the world a better place. It's not. If we force the Ukrainians into an inequitable and unfair decision to close this war down and give up their territory, there are so many people who are going to die because of it. And not just in Ukraine, all over the world, from Europe, America, countries in Asia.
Yes, we've heard many times since the full-scale Russian invasion, even before that, that if we allow Russia to succeed in Ukraine, then of course Europe is next. Now, Yevheniia, do you feel that the political rhetoric that we're constantly hearing, I don't think I can count how many meetings there have been, whether it be in Brussels or in other European capitals or summits or these NATO contact groups or in the United States or wherever. There's been literally hundreds of these gatherings so far. And the politicians seem to be saying one thing, but the actions are very different. And the rhetoric isn't often matched by the actions. And so I'd like to get your opinion on this. Is the political leadership in the West failing their own citizens, let alone Ukrainians themselves?
Well, we still understand who's who's responsible for all this tantrum in the world. So we have to be united in the Western world, or at least like-minded countries. I don't want to accuse any of the Western leaders because they already had done a lot. Ukraine would not be standing by this time if we didn't get the support. But now is a crucial moment to actually, stand up and say, as you said, enough is enough. And it is a crucial moment. Ukraine is not everlasting. We do lose a lot of people. People get tired. It just we just feel that we live in a reality show when everyone's watching and just given as much as support as not to, die instantly. But it can't be long, painful deaths for the whole nation. And it will have circumstances. But it's not too late. I mean, it is still not too late to stand up, to help with all these points that President Zelensky mentioned in the victory plan. And the Western world can do it. All the GDP combined, all the military powers combined, Russia is not that strong as it wanted to look, at least before 2022. They have to ask Iran, ask North Korea for artillery or for ballistics or even for troops. That means that they are not the second largest and most powerful army in the world. That's clearly not the case.
Right. I would like to follow up on that with the troops, because that's one thing that we don't necessarily see in this victory plan, and that's been one criticism of Ukraine, that it was too late on the mobilization, and that really the forces have dwindled so much at this point that it's a big struggle. It's a big issue. And I know for some Western leaders, they tend to point the finger in Ukraine's direction. How do you see that this situation gets solved with the manpower on the front lines that is demanded at this current stage in the war?
Well, it's always easier to point a finger on those who are dying, or who are paying with their lives, and saying you do not die, easily enough, or you do not send enough of people to get killed. I'm sorry for being this emotional, but sometimes it just feels that, we're just being watched by everyone and say, oh, you don't do that good enough. Come and stand with us and help us, not behind our back.
Yeah, I agree. Reuben, would you like to respond to that?
This whole issue, the size of the Ukrainian military, I would like to remind people that the Ukrainian military used to be a lot larger, but we had training programs that were paid for by the U.S. and other NATO countries that ever since the 90s, in which we brought in companies staffed by former military officers. The programs were designed to take Ukraine's military from a Soviet-style top-down driven command structure with large numbers of people and turn it into a NATO-type organization with fewer people but more autonomy at lower levels. So the Ukrainians saluted smartly and said, yeah, we're going to do that. We want to be in NATO. We're going to be a NATO-style, NATO structure, NATO-type command system, NATO-sized military. Now we're telling them they don't have enough. We're a hard bunch of people to please.
Yeah, we are. Yevheniia, I totally agree with you. I feel the plight of Ukrainians, and I think that the West should be doing more to address the needs of Ukrainians and the lack of the manpower. And there's certainly many things that they can do. And I hope that everybody watching this show can pressure their politicians in some which way or form. Both of you, I'd like to thank Yevheniia Kravchuk, Deputy Chair of the Ukrainian Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy. Thank you very much for joining us. And Reuben Johnson, Research Fellow at Casimir Pulaski Foundation. Thank you, sir. We appreciate it. And we'll be holding on for Ukraine and hope to have you on again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all for this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for another summary of all the latest events from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. Goodbye.